The evening of March 7th, 1963, began the way every great evening in Las Vegas began, with the promise that something extraordinary was about to happen. Not the kind of extraordinary you plan for, not the kind of extraordinary that gets written into schedules and rehearsed until it feels hollow. The real kind, the kind that arrives without knocking, that walks through the front door of a moment and changes everything standing in its path. The Sands Hotel and Casino that night was running at full electricity, not the kind that comes in the chandeliers, though those blaze above the main floor like constellations dragged indoors against their will. This was the other kind of electricity, the kind that moves between people, that hums in the air when the right combination of names and money and danger all find themselves occupying the same room at the same time. Every table was full. Every bar stool was claimed. The sounds of chips and ice and laughter and music threaded together into something that could only be described as the heartbeat of a city that never stopped. Elizabeth Taylor walked in at 11:45 in the evening. Not arrived. Walked in. There is a difference. And Elizabeth Taylor understood that difference at the cellular level. She had been performing the act of entering rooms since she was a child in Hollywood, since the cameras first pointed at her face, and the world decided it had never seen anything quite like those eyes. Violet, actual Violet, not the promotional copy written by studio publicists trying to manufacture mythology. The mythology was real, and those eyes were its evidence. She wore a dress that moved when she moved, silver and blue catching the light in ways that seemed almost calculated, except nothing about Elizabeth Taylor was calculated. That was the miracle of her. Everything looked effortless because it was effortless. She had arrived at a place in her life where her presence was simply what was: irrefutable, inarguable, incomparable. She was accompanied that evening by a small group, close friends, members of the inner circle that celebrities of that magnitude always maintained, people who understood the protocols of proximity to greatness. And walking beside her, in that easy, unhurried way of his that made the whole world seem like it was moving slightly too fast except for him, was Dean Martin. Dean Martin in 1963 existed at a particular altitude that very few people in American entertainment had ever reached. He was not merely famous. He was not merely talented, though the talent was extraordinary, a voice that could make a sad song feel like company and a funny song feel like sunlight. He was something beyond those things. He was what happened when a man became so entirely himself that the world simply arranged itself around him. He had come from Steubenville, Ohio. He had worked bars and clubs and venues that didn't deserve him, fought his way up to the machinery of show business with a partner and then without, and emerged on the other side of all of it as someone who seemed to have been born wearing a tuxedo with a glass in his hand and a half-smile that told you he already knew the punchline of whatever joke the universe was currently setting up. He was 45 years old that night. He looked 38. He laughed like a man who had nothing to prove because he didn't. They settled into a section of the main casino floor near the high-stakes blackjack tables, the area where the Sands reserved its best treatment for its most recognized guests. Drinks materialized. Conversations began. The room tilted slightly on its axis, the way rooms always did when Elizabeth Taylor and Dean Martin were in them simultaneously, as though the architecture itself was trying to get a better look. What neither of them knew, what no one at their table knew, was that 40 feet away, at a table set slightly apart from the others in the way that powerful men who want to be noticed without appearing to want to always arrange, sat a man named Sal Benedetto. He was 61 years old, compact, with the kind of physical authority that doesn't come from the gym, but from decades of other people making way for you when you walk into a space. He had thick silver hair combed straight back from a face that had weathered every kind of negotiation a man could survive. His suit was Italian custom, the kind that cost more than most people's automobiles. His cufflinks were gold. His watch was gold. Everything about Sal Benedetto announced wealth in a way that only men who began with nothing ever truly learned to announce it, which is to say loudly and without apology. In the world that Sal Benedetto occupied, he was known as a serious figure. He controlled interests across 3 states, sat at tables where decisions were made that never appeared in any newspaper, and had built a network of influence and obligation over 30 years that made him, in the specific geography of power that governed cities like Las Vegas, untouchable. He had never been charged with anything that stuck. He had never been publicly embarrassed. He had, in the worldview he constructed for himself and enforced on everyone around him, absolute authority over every room he chose to enter. He was that night in a mood that his associates recognized and feared. He had flown in from Chicago that afternoon on business that had not gone as expected. A deal he'd been constructing carefully for months had shifted in ways that disadvantaged him, not catastrophically, but in ways that felt like disrespect, and Sal Benedetto treated the feeling of disrespect the way other men treated physical pain, as something requiring immediate and decisive response. He was drinking bourbon, his third, and his eyes had that particular quality of restless searching that comes when a man of his temperament is looking for a place to put the frustration he is carrying. He saw Elizabeth Taylor. More precisely, he saw Elizabeth Taylor laughing at something Dean Martin had just said, laughing with her whole face, throwing her head back slightly, and the sight of it, the ease of it, the radiance of it, produced in Sal Benedetto something complex and ugly that he would have described to himself as irritation, but which was, in truth, something closer to envy made dangerous by bourbon. He watched them for several minutes. His associates tried to engage him in conversation. He gave them nothing. His focus had narrowed to a point. No one who watched what happened next ever agreed entirely on whether it was intentional. Some of the witnesses who were closest said it was absolutely deliberate, that Benedetto raised his glass with a motion that was too controlled to be accidental, that his eyes were locked on Elizabeth Taylor in the moment before the liquid left the glass. Others, further away, said it happened fast and confused, that Benedetto gestured towards something one of his men had said, and his arms simply swung too wide, catching the near edge of the nearest table, sending a glass of bourbon flying in an arc that ended directly over Elizabeth Taylor's head. The truth, reconstructed from dozens of accounts and the geography of the room and the direction the glass traveled, is that the distinction barely mattered. Whether the hand that threw the bourbon made a conscious decision, or whether it simply obeyed an unconscious command from the part of a man that had spent 61 years believing he could do anything he wanted to anyone he chose, the outcome was the same. Bourbon, ice, and the cold sting of violation, all of it landing on Elizabeth Taylor. The sound of the glass hitting the floor was one of those sounds that cuts through everything else. Not loud, precisely, but definitive. A sound with consequences attached to it. The music from the lounge nearby seemed to stutter. Conversations died in concentric circles, spreading outward from the point of impact. 200 people found themselves doing the same thing simultaneously, turning to look, drawing breath, understanding without being told that something had just happened that would not resolve quietly. Elizabeth Taylor stood absolutely still. Her dress, the silver-blue dress that had been catching the light so beautifully all evening, was dark with bourbon down one shoulder and across her chest. A piece of ice sat on the floor near her foot. Her hair, perfect moments before, was wet on one side. She was not crying. She was not shouting. She was doing what women who have been unexpectedly violated in public spaces often do when they are also profoundly dignified, which is hold themselves with a stillness that is itself a kind of statement. She was motionless in a way that statues are motionless, not from absence of feeling, but from an enormous quantity of it being held in perfect compression. Dean Martin had been in the middle of a sentence when it happened. He was close enough that the trajectory of the bourbon had grazed his jacket sleeve. He felt the cold of it. He saw it land on Elizabeth, and he went quiet in a way that was entirely different from the quiet of the room around him. The room's quiet was shock. Dean Martin's quiet was something else. It was the quiet of a man who has just received information and is processing it at a speed that produces no external movement. His face did not change dramatically. His expression did not collapse into rage or horror. If you had been watching him from across the room and could not see his eyes, you might have thought he had simply paused mid-thought. But if you were close enough to see his eyes, you saw something settle into them. A clarity, a decision made without drama, in the space between one heartbeat and the next. He set his glass down. He did not set it down quickly. He did not slam it. He placed it with the precision of a man who understands that the management of a moment begins with the management of his own body. Then he turned toward the table from which the bourbon had come. Sal Benedetto was already doing the thing that men who cause scenes in public spaces and do not want to own them always do, which is perform an expression of neutral surprise, as though the offense had arrived from somewhere else, and he was as bewildered by it as anyone. Two of his associates were half standing, caught between competing instincts. The third was watching Dean Martin with the particular attention of someone who recognizes incoming weather. Dean Martin walked to Benedetto's table. He walked the 40 feet between the way he walked across the stage, with no hurry whatsoever, as though all of time existed specifically to accommodate his pace. People moved out of his path, not because he asked them to, because that is what people do when a certain kind of force moves through a space. He stopped at Benedetto's table. He did not sit. He looked at Sal Benedetto for a moment that seemed to occupy more temporal space than moments technically contain. "That your drink?" Dean said. His voice was what his voice always was. Measured, carrying, the kind of voice that has been trained for decades to reach the back of a room without effort. Benedetto looked up at him. He was not a man who was easily made uncomfortable. He had looked up at police detectives and federal agents and men considerably more physically intimidating than Dean Martin, and felt nothing that could be described as intimidation. But there was something in the directness of what was in front of him that produced a slight recalibration behind his eyes. "It slipped," Benedetto said. "It slipped," Dean said. He let the words sit there for a moment, examining them. "A glass full of bourbon slipped out of your hand and traveled across 40 feet of casino floor and landed on Elizabeth Taylor." "These things happen," Benedetto said. His voice had an edge now, the edge that men in his position use when they want to communicate that the conversation is at its limit. "I'll have someone take care of the dry cleaning." The room was a hell breath. 200 people pretending not to listen, while listening with every cell in their bodies. Dean Martin smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that a man produces when he is about to demonstrate something, when he is so entirely certain of the ground he stands on that the smile is simply the overflow of that certainty. "Here's what's going to happen," Dean said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The room was quiet enough that he could have whispered and been heard by everyone. "You're going to stand up from that table. You're going to walk over to where Elizabeth Taylor is standing. And you are going to get down on your knees, and you are going to apologize to her." There was an audible intake of breath somewhere in the room, maybe everywhere in the room simultaneously. Sal Benedetto's face went through several things at once. Disbelief, contempt, the beginning of the kind of fury that men like him have weaponized over decades. His two standing associates stiffened. The third one, the one who had been watching with the weather recognition expression, placed a hand quietly on the edge of the table. "You have any idea who you're talking to?" Benedetto said. "I know exactly who I'm talking to," Dean said. "You're the man who just threw his drink on a woman, who has done nothing to you and doesn't know your name. That's who you are right now, in this room, in front of these people. Everything else you are doesn't matter here." "Dean." Benedetto's voice dropped. It became the voice he used in rooms with fewer witnesses, the voice that had preceded consequences for a great many people over 30 years. "You need to be very careful." "I'm calm as I've ever been," Dean said. "But I'm going to say it one more time, because I want to be sure you heard me. You're going to walk over there. You're going to get on your knees. You're going to apologize to that woman. Or this casino is going to have a story that gets written on every front page from here to New York by morning. And the story is going to be about Sal Benedetto throwing a drink on Elizabeth Taylor and refusing to make it right. You think they'll print that?" Benedetto said. "You think I don't own?" "You don't own this room," Dean said, and the simplicity of it was devastating. "Not tonight. Tonight, this room belongs to the people standing in it. And every single one of them is watching you decide who you are." Benedetto looked around. He was, for perhaps the first time in years, truly looking at a room full of people rather than through them. He saw faces, not the blurred background that the powerful see when they have stopped regarding other humans as fully present. He saw actual faces. He saw 200 people who were watching him with an attention that was simultaneously silent and total. Waitresses who had stopped moving. Dealers who had stepped back from their tables. Men in expensive suits who had taken a half step away from their companions to see more clearly. Women who were watching Elizabeth Taylor, and then watching Sal Benedetto, and doing the kind of calculation that women in 1963 Las Vegas had learned very early to perform invisibly. He saw Jack and Tratter, the manager of the Sands, standing near the entrance to the room. Intratter's face was composed in a particular way of men who are at the intersection of their professional obligations and their personal outrage, holding them both perfectly steady while waiting to see which way the moment broke. He saw, at the table where Elizabeth Taylor stood, that she had been joined by 3 other people who had materialized from somewhere in the room, who had moved her aside with the quiet purposefulness of people who are choosing a side before anyone has asked them to choose. And he saw Dean Martin, still standing, still with that smile that was not warm, still with those eyes that contained whatever it was that had settled into them the moment the bourbon hit the floor. Sal Benedetto had survived 61 years by reading rooms correctly. He had made mistakes in his life, serious ones, but had survived them all because he understood, at some fundamental level, the architecture of situations, the weight-bearing walls of any given moment, what could be pushed and what could not. He read this room now with the same instrument he had always used, and what the room told him was that the architecture had shifted, that Dean Martin, standing in the middle of this casino in a slightly bourbon-dampened jacket, had done something that Benedetto's own 30 years of carefully constructed power had never managed to do, which was to make Sal Benedetto the least powerful person in a room he was standing in. This was not a physical reality. Benedetto still had his man. He still had his network. He still had every instrument of consequence that he had always had. But power in a public space is not ultimately about instruments. It is about narrative. And Dean Martin had just taken the narrative of this room and rewritten it in the space of 4 minutes, turning a story about an untouchable man's casual cruelty into a story about a man being called to account in front of witnesses. The silence stretched. Then Sal Benedetto stood up. He straightened his jacket. He buttoned the middle button, which is what men of his generation did when they needed a moment to rebuild their composure into their posture. He looked at Dean Martin for a long moment with an expression that contained several things simultaneously: the residue of fury, the arithmetic of consequences, and something that was almost, if you watch very carefully, a recognition, a begrudging acknowledgement of the specific kind of courage it had taken to do what had just been done. Then he walked toward Elizabeth Taylor. The room made way for him the way the room had made way for Dean Martin, but for entirely different reasons. He stopped in front of her. Elizabeth Taylor looked at him with those violet eyes, and in them there was no fear whatsoever. There was assessment. There was the composure of a woman who had stood in front of cameras for 20 years and learned to hold herself still under any kind of scrutiny. Benedetto lowered himself to one knee. The sound of that, the sound of a man like Sal Benedetto going his knee on the floor of the Sands Casino, was a sound that the room received in silence, so complete that you could hear the fabric of his trousers against the floor. "I apologize," he said. His voice was controlled but not empty. It cost him something to say it. Everyone in the room could hear that it cost him. "What I did was wrong. It will not happen again." Elizabeth Taylor looked at him for a moment that seemed to take careful measure of everything it contained. "Thank you," she said. 2 words. No performance. No magnanimity offered as theater. Simply 2 words that closed the transaction with exactly the dignity it required. Benedetto rose. He walked back to his table. He said something quiet to his associates. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. And Sal Benedetto, who had come to Las Vegas that evening as a man who controlled rooms by force of reputation and fear, walked out of the Sands Casino with something considerably diminished trailing behind him, though it was not something that could be measured or named precisely. It was a thing that leaves a man's presence when the room he is standing in is collectively decided it is no longer afraid of him. Dean Martin watched him go. Then he turned back to Elizabeth Taylor and picked up his drink from the nearby surface, where a waiter had set a fresh one without being asked. He looked at Elizabeth for a moment, and there passed between them one of those glances that carry entire conversations without requiring words, a look that acknowledged everything that had just happened and filed it simultaneously under both the extraordinary and the simply necessary. "You all right?" he said. Elizabeth Taylor smiled. It was different from the radiant social smile she had been wearing all evening. This one was smaller, realer. The smile of someone who has just been reminded that protection is still a thing that exists in the world. "I will be," she said. "Thanks to you." Dean raised his glass slightly. Not quite a toast, not quite a dismissal. Just a small gesture that meant something like, of course. And also, that's enough said about it. And also, you're welcome. And also, I need another drink after that. Then he turned back to the room. The room exhaled. It did not go back to exactly what it had been before. Rooms never do after something like that. The music started again, and the chips started moving, and the conversations resumed. But all of it was slightly different. Scored underneath was something that had not been there before. A kind of awareness that the space had just demonstrated something about itself. That certain things were not permitted here. Not because the rules said so, because Dean Martin had said so. The story of that night spread through Las Vegas with a particular velocity of stories that contained something people need to hear. By the following morning, every casino on the Strip had a version of it. By the end of the week, it had reached the entertainment press. By the end of the month, it had become one of those stories that gets told at parties and in back rooms and at tables late at night when the conversation turns to the question of what courage actually looks like when it shows up in the world without warning. Some versions of the story inflated it. Some versions gave it details it didn't have. Turned it into something longer and more dramatic than it was. That is what happens to stories that contain something true. The truth at the center of them attracts embellishment the way light attracts moths. People add things because they want the story to be as large as what it contains. And sometimes what it contains is too large for facts alone to hold. But the essential architecture of it held, in every version, in every telling. Dean Martin had seen something happen to someone he cared about. He had walked 40 feet across the floor of a casino and stood in front of a man who was accustomed to being untouchable. He had asked for accountability. Without flinching, he had gotten it. What was less well understood in the years after was what had made it possible. People focus on the confrontation, on the extraordinary drama of a man like Sal Benedetto going his knee on the casino floor. They treated it as though the decisive element was Dean Martin's willingness to confront. But the decisive element was something quieter than that. The decisive element was the calm. Dean Martin had not shouted. He had not threatened with the language of violence. He had not performed outrage for the room. He had simply stood in front of a situation and refused to be moved by it in the direction of fear. And in doing so, he had created a kind of gravity that pulled everything else in the room toward him. 200 people had been given permission by the stillness of one man to understand that this moment had a right outcome and that the right outcome was achievable. This is what courage actually looks like in a world when it's not in the movies. It does not look like the movies. It does not arrive with swelling music and a speech written to land in the third act. It arrives in the middle of other things, in the middle of evenings that were supposed to be pleasant, in the form of a man setting down his glass and walking 40 feet with unhurried steps and opening his mouth and saying exactly what needs to be said. There are people who were in the Sands Casino on the night of March 7th, 1963, who talked about what they witnessed for the rest of their lives. Not all of them, not even most of them, but a particular subset of those 200 people, people who were at ages that were ready to receive it, people who were in that specific season of life when you were still assembling the internal architecture of what you believe about how the world can work. Those people carried what they saw with them like a seed. Some of them, years later, in circumstances entirely unrelated to casinos or celebrities or organized crime, found themselves in situations where someone needed someone to walk 40 feet and say the thing that needed to be said. And some of them found that they were able to do it, not because they had practiced, not because they had told themselves they would, but because somewhere in the back of their minds, below the level of deliberate thought, lived the memory of a man in a casino, setting down his glass and walking. The Sands itself became, after that night, a kind of landmark in the internal map of Las Vegas that the people who truly knew the city carried, not for the building itself, which was extraordinary but not unique, for what the building had witnessed, for the particular quality of space that a room acquires when something real happens inside it, when the furniture of ordinary life gets moved aside for a moment, and what is left is just human beings deciding who they are. Elizabeth Taylor spoke about that night in various interviews over the subsequent decades, never at great length, never in a way that suggested she needed the story to do anything other than be what it was. She described Dean's response the way you describe something that was done for you by someone who understood that it needed to be done and did not need to be thanked for understanding. with a kind of gratitude that was itself restrained, because the thing being acknowledged was so large that ordinary gratitude seemed inadequate, and so you simply noted it and let it stand. He saw what was happening, she said once, years later, in a way that contained everything. And he did what he did. That's who Dean was. Dean Martin, when asked about it, answered the way he answered most questions about moments in which he had done something that other people found remarkable. He found another way to discuss the drink. But those who knew him well, those who had watched the particular expressions that crossed his face when something touched a part of him that was not the performance, said that what happened at the Sands in 1963 was one of the moments he returned to. Not proudly, exactly. Pride was not quite the right word for what he carried about it. More like a man who keeps a particular object on a shelf not because it's decorative, but because it reminds him of a time when he was exactly what he needed to be. Sal Benedetto left Las Vegas the next morning and did not return for 7 years. When he did return, he came as a private citizen, unremarkable, attended by no retinue. He played cards quietly and left. No one threw a drink on anyone in his presence. No one needed to, because the story had preceded him, as stories do. And the story said something that no amount of reputation or money or organized threat could effectively counter, which is that in a specific casino on a specific night, Sal Benedetto had been brought to his knee on the floor by a singer from Ohio who had nothing in his hands except the absolute conviction that what he was doing was right. There are cities that understand particular mathematics of reputation better than anywhere else on earth, and Las Vegas in the 1960s was chief among them. In that city, in that era, what happened in a room in front of witnesses was the only currency that truly mattered, because it could not be recalled, renegotiated, or revised. It existed in the memory of everyone who saw it, and it existed in the story that those witnesses carried out of the room and released into the world. And once it was in the world, it belonged to the world and was no longer anyone's private property. The lesson that Sal Benedetto taught the city of Las Vegas on March 7, 1963, was not the lesson he arrived intending to teach. He had intended, insofar as he had intended anything, to exist as he always existed, as a gravitational force around which smaller objects organize themselves. What he taught instead, by accident, by the unconscious arithmetic of a bad mood and a bourbon glass and 40 feet of casino floor, was a lesson about what happens when power miscalculates its audience. Power that mistakes the silence of a room for permission is the most vulnerable kind of power there is. Because when the silence breaks, it breaks in ways that cannot be controlled, cannot be recalled, and cannot be explained away. The silence of the Sands Casino on the night of March 7th had not been permission. It had been the silence of a room, waiting to find out who it was. And Dean Martin answered that question for the room, answered it by doing what he did, which is simply refuse to allow the moment to pass without accountability. This is a story of one room, one night, one glass of bourbon thrown in the wrong direction. But it is also the story of something that does not change regardless of the decade, or the city, or the names of the people involved. It is the story of what happens when someone decides, without fanfare, without preparation, without anything except the certainty of the thing itself, to stand between cruelty and the person it is aimed at. The people who are capable of that are not always the people you would predict. They are not always the physically brave. They are not always the ones with authority or weapons or systems of consequence behind them. They are sometimes simply the person who happens to be standing close enough to see clearly, who has not yet made peace with the idea of watching and saying nothing, who walks the 40 feet, because the 40 feet are there and someone has to walk them. Dean Martin walked them, and in a casino full of people who would spend the rest of their lives remembering that they were there to see it. The night of March 7th, 1963, stopped being just a night in Las Vegas and became instead one of those fixed points in time that everyone who lived near it used afterward to calibrate themselves, to remember what it looked like when someone did the right thing, not because it was safe, but because it was right, and because the person who needed it was standing there in a wet dress, wondering if anyone was going to do anything at all. Someone was. Someone always has to be. The question this story leaves behind, the one that follows you out of the casino and into the street and back to wherever you came from, is not whether you know who Dean Martin was. It is whether, when your moment comes, when the glass has already left the hand and the room has already gone quiet, and someone is standing in front of you wondering if anyone is going to do anything, whether you have it in you to set down your drink and walk the 40 feet. because the 40 feet are always there. The only question is who walks them.